Okido. Musicology without composers. What do I mean by that? The great thing when you do music research and you give a presentation, you can actually bring a piece of music and play it to your audience, and this is what I'm going to do. We're going to listen to some nice music now. Please listen to this here. So I've gotten a question for you now. What effect does this excerpt has on you? What effect does it have on you? Could anyone describe the effects? What did you feel when you listened to this? What did you think? Uplifting. Okay. Calmed. Okay. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think for me, it was a slightly loud and harsh form of reproduction, which I could hear in some kind of conflict. I mean, it's just the particular sound technology probably wasn't very well adapted to a piece of music that one might think of as calm and uplifting.
Okay.
But also, I'm a historian. I start to historicise the music. I'm thinking, when might that have been written?
Okay, so you're a special audience, you're all academics, so you start to theorize right away. But most people, sorry, so beautiful, no. Most people, they engage with music because of its emotional effects. So that's the main motivation to listen to music privately, to go to concerts, but also to actually practically make music here in a community choir. It has impact on people, so there's a lot of research on the functions of music listening, and here the survey that was conducted by a colleague of mine identified 3 big groups of motivations or functions of music listening, so to become self-aware, to relate to others, social bonding, and arousal and mood regulation. However, if we look into traditional musicology, so how would a traditional musicologist studied this piece of music? Well, first of all, you can look at its score, and you can do an analysis of that, and you can treat it as a piece of art. And somehow that's already kind of assuming that there's some kind of religious or sacral element in it, and it's produced by this genius, Johannes Brahms. Isn't he a beautiful man, very impressive character? So somehow the origins of historical musicology lie in focusing on these 2 things: the artifacts that were produced, analyzing them, trying to make sense of them, and the people behind them, and basically trying to prove what their genius was. So how did we get there? Well, according to Richard Pankert, Western music was considered aesthetically superior to non-Western music, and the main task of both musicology, in particular the humanities as a whole, was to understand, at least implicitly, to document the achievements of wild male geniuses. So musicology even could be considered, according to him, somehow racist and sexist, and promoted concepts of geniuses, which are, from a scientific point of view, really, really questionable. So what I'm going to propose, that we can actually do research without these assumptions. We don't have to consider composers of music. And I'd like to show you an alternative approach to music research that tries to be truly interdisciplinary and also diverse. And that research has a guideline, and it's one research we incorporate in our research group, that we try to focus on the core effects of music. So on these things that matter to people, the reasons why people engage with music. So our questions here could be, why do people respond to it emotionally? How are emotions induced by music different to other emotions we experience? Are these emotions universal? Can we predict these responses? Can we use that some kind of functional way? Or how does music bond us together socially? A second guideline is that we try to employ an interdisciplinary and diverse methodology. And obviously, this is not new. This has always been there. So music research, musicology, in its first conception in ancient times, for example, Pythagoras was considered to be a science. Okay? Music was studied with scientific methods. And also, in the 19th century, when musicology was established as a field, Guido Adler wrote about it, and he wrote this very relevant article that was received quite strongly, at least in the German-speaking community, about the structure of musicology, and he identified two different strengths of musicology: the historical musicology, so that's the one I basically presented to you. You look at the work, the composer, performer, you're trying to work out what is important about them, where did they get their ideas from. But then you have systematic musicology as an additional way to look for similarities in music, to work out in a systematic way what are the underlying concepts, functionalities. So that puts music and sound into a broad interdisciplinary field, and this is how we do music psychology today. So music is only one aspect here. It links up with education, psychology, physics, philosophy, biology, and anthropology, and out of that we create lots of different new areas of research. A third, an additional guideline is that we do research on all parties, everyone who's involved in a musical communication. So while traditionally research would have focused a lot on the composer, performer, producer, and their artifacts, which is music, score, performances, we try to also include in this audiences and listeners. And in this project that I'm actually visualizing here, we do audience response studies. So we're interested in how audiences judge the aesthetic value of music that was presented to them in a concert, and then we're trying to work out how that links up with their emotional responses and so on and so forth. So for that, we use an interdisciplinary methodology using psychological methods and questionnaires that are filled in on iPads, physiological measurements of arousal through skin conductance, heart rate, and facial expressions, which are also mapped. When we do that, we are much more interested in understanding similarities than differences. So the social scientist Elisabeth Noelle-Neumann said, or she actually wrote a book which is called All, Not Everyone. As social scientists, we're not interested in individuals and trying to understand their personal background. We are trying to understand what do different individuals actually have in common. How can we understand them as a larger group? So how can we understand the audience as a whole, as opposed to individual people there, individual musicians? What do people have in common, and not how do they differ? And the fifth guideline perspective would be to consider other representations in our music research that go beyond its genre, its composition, or its performance. So if you look into the Brahms example here, you can obviously analyze the score and do lots of interesting things with that. But in one experiment that I conducted, I actually extracted several acoustical parameters from this piece of music and quantified it. Then we measured responses from Western Canadian listeners to this music and other music pieces, and also from people in the Congo who have never been exposed to Western music, because in this case, we were interested in universal responses. So trying to work out, are there musical parameters that have similar effects in very, very different people? And what did we find? Yes, we found that these acoustical descriptors of the pieces, so not only Brahms, but also lots of other pieces, indeed induced increases in subjective arousal and physiological arousal in both groups of participants. So we can say that to a certain degree, music was had an impact universally, independent of the cultural and personal background of our listeners. So if I come back to my original question, is it appropriate to music research without composers? I would say yes, because there are a lot of very interesting other questions to be asked about music. Thank you.
Hello. Hauke, thank you
Yeah.
for your talk. I have a small challenge for you.
Yes?
You've binned composers from musicology on the grounds that you wish to see greater diversity and broader interests. That is fantastic. But composers, of course, are diverse. And one of the failings of musicology is that it has been written in certain ways, as have all histories. And we've neglected a whole bunch of things in the process.
Yeah.
So shouldn't we be really asking broader questions of our discipline? Because I do worry that musicology ultimately only tells us what composers have put in the music in the first place. Should we not ask those more broader questions about who makes music and what they are doing and what their links to their culture and society are? And I'm minded that you show Pythagoras as the beginning of, a more scientific approach. And I'm also minded that ultimately he's a middle-aged white dude. And at least 600 years before then, you've got people in Asia looking at the spectral harmonics of bell sets and so on. So, we've got to do something about this, surely, as a broader problem.
Yeah, it's definitely a broader problem. There are, I definitely recognize also just within sort of historical, non-scientific musicology, people are very concerned about lots of different factors nowadays and don't only compose on these white, rich Western dudes. I think my point here is actually about the methodology. So how do we approach these questions? So when we talk about diversity, it's often understood in form of musical diversity, but I would say, why don't we talk about academic diversity? So why is it appropriate to study a score ignoring any person that actually listens to that score eventually through a performance? Why is that more appropriate than summarizing one piece of music with a couple of numbers and representing it acoustically through that? Because this is the kind of feedback that I sometimes get from other musicologists. Yeah, I think you were...
So I guess, first of all, I really enjoyed that and have a lot of sympathy for the case you're making. I think my question builds on the previous one, and it's to say, in your presentation of a different methodology, you ended up a little bit having a binary between the individual and the universal. And I guess I would want to ask you or press you to say a bit more about how there might be subgroups within that. So, for example, if you took an audience at a musical performance, be it a pop concert or a classical music concert or whatever, or a group of people in a different culture enjoying music together, there would be subdivisions within that audience. Let's say it might be divided between those who were also themselves practitioners and not practitioners. There might be differences of age or other things that would be important. And I think, and that's those. What I've just said stands somewhere between the universal, what might be true for anybody involved in a musical event, and the individual. And I'm just wondering how you would want to take account of that.
Yes, so these are basically two extremes, and this is a spectrum. There's lots of different perspectives in the middle. We, of course, are also interested in individual differences. I just simplified it a little bit. But I'm interested in an inter-individual difference that I can generalize, that doesn't only apply to a few individuals that I'm studying, but like you just said, one group of people that have this background, that group of people that have another background, and then that's how, is there something similar or different in them that can be generalized also to other people who I haven't studied, who were not part of the sample? Yeah.
This may come across as slightly illiterate, but I was just wondering, all the examples that you gave and the images that you showed was people with headphones and people listening to music mediated by technology in that sense. And this goes back to Joanna's observation in the beginning that, this was noise, but probably it was not well connected to the technology. So I was just wondering, would individual differences, especially between different cultures, of experience of music differ when you were actually experiencing music in more sensory ways, in a live kind of setting? Or, if you showed that extreme example of Africans hearing music on the headphone, it's not really the same. So I was just wondering if this affects the overall understanding of your research question.
Yes, it definitely does, and we are very concerned about this. So music tends to be mediatized, and that has an potential important role. I've just submitted a grant proposal to the HRC to study exactly the effect of mediatization on music experience. I didn't know if they're going to fund this. They might tell me that I shouldn't quantify audience experiences with numbers, because that's not the way to do music research, unfortunately. This is the response I'm preparing myself for. So I'm very much interested in these questions, but I feel there's a lot of resentment from people who are not familiar with these methodologies and very skeptical about them, and therefore don't support them.